Welcome to another edition of Grace Under Pressure, where my guest today is Leah Weiss. I'll tell you all about Leah in a minute. Those of you who know the show know that LinkedIn Live, we focus on Grace Under Pressure, that is, focuses on all the issues which are too often dismissed as the soft stuff, the caring, the commitment, the compassion we exert for others. And when you do these things as a leader, you bring people together and you act for common cause and you energize them. Welcome, Leah. It is a pleasure to have you today.
Thanks so much, John. It's great to be here with you and with all of you.
Great. I want to tell everybody about Leah Weiss, Ph.D. You are an award winner. Oh, excuse me. I am botching this. My apologies. Anyway, I was reading the bio of my previous guest, and you don't care about him. Actually, Dr. Leah Weiss is a co-founder of the Stanford Compassion Cultivation Program, which was conceived by the Dalai Lama. You can't do any better than that. And she's been a longtime lecturer at Stanford Graduate School of Business. Way cool. She's a co-founder of Skylight, which is a startup to help managers address workplace mental health issues using data-driven solutions. And guess what? Artificial intelligence. That is cool. And she's working with Stanford Health, Mayo Clinic, Genentech, Google, and NASA. So you're my second guest that has done work with NASA. So that's wonderful. Leah, welcome to the show.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Great. Burnout is a major issue and only getting worse. And I told you before the show that I've talked to other guests about the topic. I wish I didn't have to, but I'm glad that you're here. So, and it's costing us something upwards of almost $200 billion in wasted time, shall we say. So how do we, let's see, we talk about it. How do we identify with burnout? Because a lot of people, especially this audience, they are high achievers and they want to, my word, muscle through it. So what do we need to be careful about? Leah?
So some of the things we want to keep in mind, first of all, the World Health Organization's definition, emotional exhaustion, coupled with dehumanization, depersonalization of ourselves, of others, when we start instrumentalizing, not seeing other people around us or ourselves as human and all that entails. And then finally, lack of self-efficacy. I think really important when we're describing burnout, that we understand it's not binary, on or off, you have it or you don't. There's a spectrum. And tricky for those of us who are overachievers and perfectionists to understand that the early phases of burnout mask as workaholism. So they become very difficult to self-diagnose. The upshot being we need to understand what these signs are so we can support our teams, so we can take action ourselves before things become more acute and then more difficult. Kind of like the metaphor, better to do preventative health than to treat an acute illness later.
Right. Now you said something, and it's a term that we've heard forever. And I think maybe we've heard it so much, we kind of dismiss it as, and that's the term emotional burnouts or emotional exhaustion. How does that manifest itself? I mean, is it fatigue or how do you define it, Leah?
Yeah, it's interesting because emotional exhaustion can show up in different ways. For some people, it turns into a detachment or cynicism. For other people, it can lead to displaced conflict, which is actually the fourth stage of burnout. So when you're an example that I think many of us can relate to, you've had such an intense day at work that maybe you get through that and you keep it together, but then you go home and you have no patience for your children or your spouse. So you're
not me, of course.
Never me. Never, especially with my two little boys, never. but I think this is the piece that understanding that we get depleted and we don't always notice when that's happening or what the implications are.
You said something that I had never seen the link to, but you mentioned being a workaholic and burnout. I know that workaholicism leads to it, but is there some, I mean, if we're wired to, as high achievers, we want to work, we define ourselves, maybe we shouldn't, but through our work. So what are the warning signs?
Yeah, well, good to keep in mind. One of the nuances that I always think is helpful, we want to have high standards. We want to care about our work. We want to be invested. We want to push to get things to where they need to be. Working hard is not the only or even necessarily primary precipitant of burnout. Moral injury, when we lack community or a sense of belonging, when part of our work requires that we act against our values or we're bearing witness to behavior that stands at odds with our values, or even when we just don't feel sufficient sense of purpose, those all massively combine and can be different angles that lead into burnout, not just hours worked. So if you think of like an example for healthcare, physicians are really good at working hard. They would have not gotten all the way through pre-med, med, residency, fellowships. But what pushes many over the edge into these really astronomical rates of burnout right now is moral injury or frustration with poorly run administrations or unsustainable systems that they're a part of. So that is the part of burnout I'd love to see more of us think about as well, not just hours worked, although that isn't a factor in this other side.
Could you explain moral injury a little more? I mean, I can think of it. Would it be a form of harassment? But take the form of harassment.
Well, actually, so moral injury can happen in a number of different ways. One of the this literature came first out of healthcare. So a very familiar example there would be, in order to help a patient, you might have to cause pain to insert an IV. Right, to administer pain. Yeah. There's components of moral injury that happen that are not as logical. So this became really a prominent area of study for veterans of military combat, that it became clear that those who experience more acute post-traumatic stress, often it was tied to them having to participate in behavior, clearing a village and seeing a child that reminded them of a child of their own. So that kind of, when your values through your behavior are deeply challenged, your values are transgressed by the situation that you are in. Healthcare, you don't have the time to spend with the patients. You can't get clearance for the medications you want to deliver. That kind of thing, when you're working on a product that isn't having the outcomes that you want, or it's having environmental impact you're aware of, you need to keep the job, you're not, but you're complicit. Those kinds of things really drag us down over time.
No, thank you for exploring that. And I guess there, of course, with experiencing those kinds of things, they exact a cost. We're all aware of the topic of PTSD, but in a sense, this moral injury, which could be causative to PTSD, but it's more pervasive than one might think. So
Exactly.
So, all right. And then just speaking more broadly, the burnout for us, but how does burnout affect our colleagues? Is it our underperformance, or how does it manifest itself? Leah?
Yeah, it really wraps around into our whole lives, because early on in, let's say, the first couple of phases of burnout, we start neglecting our personal care, our needs. There's maybe displacement of conflict. We start to withdraw, see behavioral changes. Some people get more anxious, other people more depressed or combative. When we think about, one of the ways I find it helpful to frame this interpersonally is really to think about burnout as a systems interaction. So Dr. Christina Masloch, one of the key researchers on this topic, she uses a metaphor of, if you're looking at burnout and you're trying to solve it from an individual perspective, it's like You're asking a pickle, why are they becoming a cucumber in the vinegar barrel, right? It makes no sense to say to the cucumber, what are you doing? So that's when we want to start looking at things like
that's a great metaphor. So
it's powerful, right? And so playing off of that at the team level, what are the mindsets that we're playing out? Are there hero complexes? I was just on a call with a leader yesterday, and she was telling me that she is being ground down in her role right now, but there's no one else who can do what she does in this whole enormous organization. So I have to save everybody. I'm the only one who can do this. So I have to work 14-hour days, and I know that's not sustainable. Or when you validate.
Let me stop right there, because I have heard that before. And when I tell you that I'm the only one that can do this, Leah, what do you tell me?
If we're if I think you're in a place where you can get some pretty direct feedback, I would question that, why you believe that's true, what you've done to lift up your team and empower them and delegate, all of which are really important skills. You're not an individual contributor anymore, John. So what are you doing as a leader to create a system that's sustainable, not just for yourself, but for everyone? And what message are you sending to them if you're telling them you're disempowering them and not believing in their capacity?
No, that's good. But, actually, and you have heard these coming, I'm the only one, but sometimes it's actually true, because in a maybe a data or a science thing, they may be the only one on the team with that expertise. So that's another dilemma.
Angle. Well, then the onus, I would say, still, we need to have autonomy is something that is critical in the team, in appropriate timelines, benchmarks. So let's look at, the pandemic has changed how so many components of organizations are structured across sectors and supply chains and all kinds of things. If you are in a position where you're the only person who can do something and there's not enough hours in the day, a functional organization that's going to do better has a climate where you can give feedback and say, actually, given the context that we're in, we need to change our metrics, our goals, our timelines. Otherwise, this is unreasonable. We're going to fail. And it's not just bad for me. It's bad for all of us. Better to call out the cliff ahead, problem solve around it. So if that's really true and you can't get additional resources, you better plan a different strategy, or you're not going to, you'll ground yourself into the ground. Then there's no one to replace you, and you still won't hit what you need to do.
Such logical explanation, and good. And sometimes logic is what eludes us the most. So anyway, so now we touched on the financial cost of stuff, but what's the physical cost to us? Leah?
Yeah. Well, there's so many different components of this. And this is a place where I think the current and unfolding research is really important to our understanding. So things like our amygdalas, what people call the lizard brain, or the oldest.
It's not a lizard brain in mine. It's a highly developed.
Of course, yours is, and mine is as well. Just ask me when I'm hangry. So that part of our brain actually expands when we're burnt out, and our prefrontal cortex and our higher order of the structures associated with higher order thinking then have less resources. Anxiety increases, headaches, dizziness, a lot of hormonal changes happen. So hair loss is common, voice, which is very interesting, voice loss, chronic infections, GI issues, and then sleep, of course, panic attacks. All of these things can be components of burnout. So, of course, you want to go to a healthcare provider to do a differential diagnosis for you. But important to understand, if you or someone on your team is having chronic infections and health issues, that this could be worth looking at.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I'm glad you quantified it, because, so often, especially, high performers, and we live in the cognitive realm, and we kind of push our physicality off to one side. And that's why things like, yoga or meditation are so vital for us. So I'm sure that's the kind of work that you would do at the Stanford Center, the Compassion. Am I correct? So.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the sides of what we need to look at is the individual interventions around resilience. And those might include things like meditation, might include working on sleep, nutrition, physical health. The other
I like your term, working on sleep. That's almost an oxymoron, but
I know.
explain what you mean by that. So.
Yeah, improving our sleep hygiene, understanding, what are we doing habit-wise that might be contributing to disrupted sleep, which has been a huge problem since before the pandemic. But since the pandemic, insomnia is like, it's rare to find the person who hasn't gone through at least phases with struggling with sleep in the last year. Yeah. So there's all these individual components we want to work on, but I also want to go back to the cucumber pickle metaphor that I think for listeners to also give thought to, not just what can I do to build more rest and relaxation and rejuvenation in my life, but what can I do to support my team and to ask for support from my team so that, for example, this summer, if someone's taking a vacation, including me, they can truly unplug and rest and not be part of the meme about kind of American approach to vacation of like, a European person might say, I'll be back in a week or 2 weeks.
I just got a note from a group in Italy. We're closed till September. I go,
Right. But you see the autoresponders from many organizations here. It's I'm out, but if you need me, text me or email me.
Right.
And you're like, well, but how are you really getting any rest with that? So what are we doing for our teams? Like having that conversation. How am I supporting you? How are you supporting me? And if you can't actually cover my work because you don't have the skill set, then how are we creating a timeline that allows me to be a human being and live a sustainable life?
Okay. Now I'm going to ask a question. I think you've probably heard this from the more senior people that you coach, and you are an accomplished coach and very well noted for your good work. So I'm a successful executive and I'm suffering burnout. Okay. And I know I need help. I need vacation. What's that first step? Because it's an act of courage, is it not, Leah?
I think it is. I think the other connection that often helps people, the more burned out you are, remember that third component of the definition, lack of self-efficacy, really important to recognize the more burned out we are, the less agency we're probably feeling to take the reins and do what we need to do. So there's a built-in paradox there that means us coaches need to really support and potentially push our clients to recognize you might have more agency than you're feeling in this moment because you're so burned out. That's part of the definition of burnout. And then, keeping an eye on this hero complex idea that only I can do this. Yeah. I had a CEO of a very large, well-known biotech company visit my class at Stanford. And he had been a very successful engineer before becoming CEO of this company. And his point to the students was, what I had to realize when I was CEO is that I had to stop entering every room thinking I could solve the engineering problems better than the people that were working around the clock on them, and understand that my value add actually was a different kind of value add now. So I would say if you're that operationally indispensable, you can't take a vacation, you need to look at how you're setting up your operations, would be the unfiltered push.
No, absolutely. And that's great. And you did touch on the fact that the CEO had come into your class. And I'm going to say a quick note, and I know you probably do the same thing. Leaders speak out, because more and more our senior leaders, they know this. And our military, I think, is a wonderful example of this. And we've seen it in our 20 years of war, whereas once upon a time, the concept of PTSD was shameful. You don't talk about it. But more and more, we've seen senior officers come out and said, I've had it. I have suffered from it. You're not making this up. Seek help. And I think your leader probably experienced the burnout himself at some point. So now, speaking out, leaders, you make it safe for others. Would you agree, Leah Leah, excuse me, Leah.
No problem. I absolutely agree. And I think that's been actually one of the silver linings of COVID, to use that cliche, that we are normalizing conversations around mental health. It's much more frequent to see leaders doing this and being well received. And I also think this is a place where we're getting a great push from the younger generations entering the workforce who have less stigma around talking about mental health, more expectation that their needs and resources are going to be provided. And I think like even the competition to attract top talent is pushing smart organizations to really change approaches, including what you're saying.
That's great. Leads into my next topic as we're becoming more enlightened as organizations. And you tie this in, and I had never made the connection. What does an emphasis on diversity and inclusion, how can that help us deal with burnout? And
Yeah, I love this question. I'm really glad you're asking it. And particularly in this moment, 3 million women in America have left the workforce during the pandemic. Women are twice as likely as men to say they can't keep up with all the demands between work and life outside of work, whether that's parenting or caregiving for elders. I think.
Oh, you've got 2 children at home. You've got plenty of.
Oh, I've got
time.
3. One's at camp this week. But I'm thinking about the other 2.
What do you do with all your spare time?
Yeah, exactly. I work on my sleep hygiene, and nobody helps me. Yeah, there's some funny disruptions last night. A nightmare about a giant thumb kept me up from my 6-year-old. Yeah. Yeah, but I think so what we need to think about with additional stressors, and then what I was just saying about women leaving the workplace, women of color, people of color, when you're experiencing additional friction in your daily interactions, if you feel like these systems weren't built with you in mind, then that happens not just at work, but around the clock. Maybe you feel less of a sense of belonging. Conversations are more stressful. You're seeing more microaggressions or bullying or exclusion happening. All of that takes a toll. And then there's a very basic math on it, from what I've been doing a lot of interviews around women leaving the workforce with the pandemic. And, one of the points we can't forget, the structural inequity in pay, meaning if you're a family pragmatically sitting down saying we have 2 incomes, this last year we weren't going to be able to get childcare. So who does it make sense to pull out? If the woman across many families is the one who's a lower earner, she's the one who's going to lean out. The problem is women, once they're out, women are more likely to support other women, 10 times more likely as a woman leader to bring in others. So this is actually a problem that's going to continue to play out if we don't step in and correct it. And then from a purely enlightened self-interest perspective, organizations need to build with more inclusion in mind now, because it's just antiquated to think about a model that was built on only certain groups and having the knowledge and expertise of those groups and the sales force and the product teams and all of these functions. You're going to be enriched. We know this through research by diversity. So how do you build a tenable situation for people to not only get hired into, but then to thrive within?
Right. Now, aligned to this issue is the racial injustice that has come to the fore. It's always been with us, but it's a highlight, and it seems like there's more mobilization around it. And so how is addressing the idea of burnout going to affect us in that area, Leah?
Well, I think some of the work that I'm doing now in quantifying, when we're working with getting team health metrics and we're helping organizations understand, look, organizations have just been caught massively surprised by how many people have exited the workforce intentionally in this last period of time. We just talked about women, but there's this whole YOLO, you only live once, people quitting, no prediction from HR analytics about this happening. I think what we need to do is understand that we have to think about engagement statistics differently. And we also have to look at how race and gender are factoring in, because the vast majority, 80% of people who leave a job leave because of their relationship with their manager and their team. So these are very costly problems to have. It's not just because we want to be ethical, better people. Right. It's also self-interest.
And I think that's a valuable point, and that years ago, when the quote diversity became a word within organizational, we always made the ROI connection to it. But and so it's still and now I think the most important thing, and I think this gets maybe a solution for the way the stresses in our system, is inclusion. Would you say that, Leah?
Yeah, well, and I really I've been doing a lot of work with the literature on belonging as well. And I think what's nice about that construct is it includes a lot of elements, kind of some related to psychological safety, some related to opportunity for professional development, some related to perception of adding value through one's ideas or being listened to. And I think there's like a robustness to that hits beyond, just like, let's make sure we have people from all different backgrounds in the room. If they don't know how to talk to each other and they can't listen to the kind of dominant viewpoint, you're not going to benefit from that diversity. So belonging, I'd say, is where it's at.
I love you using that term belonging. And I know from, and I'm belatedly, ignorance for me, that my Black colleagues, I, until recently, never realized the stresses that people of minorities would feel in the workplace. And it's not that they're being, it's not aggression toward them, although that is a whole nother problem, but just the code switching, if you will, the cultural differences, and that's a stressor. And do you address that, Leah?
I think it's really important, and part of the way we need to address this is by getting team level metrics at how people are perceiving one another. And I think keeping an eye from a leadership perspective in times of stress like we've been under, there's a tendency to go to the known person and go to the repeated kind of process, which can continue to sideline. And there's been a lot of statistics coming out now about how remote work or hybrid work is going to disproportionately hold back people of color and women, because the face time is actually really critical for them to get opportunities that people aren't in the habit of giving. So I think we all need to be hyper attentive to this right now.
I have been thinking of this issue for a long time now, at least a year, about the virtual work and eventual hybrid. And I've always thought, here's my little thing I said a year ago. This is going to be a great topic for PhD candidates, so to study it. But so if the people that you coach, Leah, if they say, how can I address, we have a virtual workforce, we like it. How do I ensure promotability among people of difference and gender? What would you say to them? So.
What you need to do first is understand how they're perceiving the work environment and find a way to get sufficiently anonymized data about what problems people are facing so that you even know where you need to remedy. So I think a data-driven approach to this is critical. And there's, I've been working on solutions to this. There's approaches out there to get this input on. Start by understanding where you are, not your take on where you are, your people's take on where you are. And then from there, problem solve. Is it a problem of professional fulfillment? Is it a problem of people need flexibility to stay in the workforce because there's still so many unknowns with childcare, elder care, all these kinds of things? I remember doing a workshop in Palo Alto one time, and it became very clear in the organization that all the people of color were in roles that didn't pay enough for them to live in Palo Alto. So many of them were commuting 2-3 hours a day. So that itself, these structural challenges, are you addressing something like that? Or are you, or are you addressing, is it about distribution of opportunity, for example?
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. Sadly, we are coming to the end, and this has been fascinating. I could go for another 2 minutes. No, I could go for much longer. Leah, you have so much to share with us, so thank you. But I ask all of our guests for a story about grace, and I know you have one, and would you share it with us, please? So.
Yeah, I would be happy to. Well, actually, and this happened, we were initially scheduled to speak a few weeks ago, and I lost my mother-in-law, and in this process, of during this period in COVID and limited access to visiting and wanting my husband to spend as much time with her as possible in her last days, we had so many people step in, our neighbors, to watch the kids so that I could do a talk, or fire alarms went off in the middle of the night. I had not one, but two neighbors come over to help me figure this out. People in my organization bending over backwards to depressure. Your response when I needed to reschedule, right? So this kind of common humanity, care, flexibility, I really am grateful for it, and I really want to pay it forward whenever the opportunity arises.
Oh, I have no doubt. I think you have been paying it forward for a long time, Leah. So, and thank you for that. And again, it illustrates that grace. I have people talk about transactional things and transformative, and yours were simple acts of kindness that we can all do for one another. All we have to do is do it. And so thank you for that reminder. Leah, how can people find you? So
my company's website, Skylight, we have some great resources, resilience quizzes, compassion tool to use with managers. LinkedIn, I'm pretty active on LinkedIn. And then I have a personal website. And I guess last and not least, my book, How We Work, really lays out a lot of my very practical suggestions for living a more sane life.
Great. And thank you. We will put these in the notes, and I appreciate you being on. So thank you. And with that, we'll close out.
Thanks.